Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the High Dragon's Breath Bow Wow, welcoming you back to another episode of Archons, Armies, rounding out our last set of Imperial Navy with Grand Cruisers, plus Battlecruisers and Battleships. I collated all of these videos so they wouldn't all be 20 minutes. I know that I am appealing to the audience of people who have more than a 10-minute attention span. Let's get right into it with Grand Cruisers. What the hell are they, and what do they do? Well, a big thing of what they are is they are one of the oldest ship designs in the Imperium, only outstripped by a couple others even older vessels. So they are the old Earth fighting vessels. They are the first capital ships. As a result, they are some of the heaviest armored vessels available way back when, which means that they sacrifice a lot of their flexibility for pure firepower. None of this fancy multimodal, multiple sections, different weapon types, and various different flexible options. The Grand Cruiser is made of 50% armor and 50% cold hard gunpowder. All of these are incredibly well armed because of their stacked guns rather than their series or banked guns. Banked guns are set up in groups of 3 or groups of 4 on the side of a vessel. The Grand Cruiser instead opts to have 4 separate banks stacked up 2 by 2 on each side, giving it a massive firepower advantage with its Tier 3 weaponry, even greater as an individual set to those of cruisers, meaning that in sheer firepower it actually beats out some battleships, but the battleship is far better armored and usually has much more armament than the Grand Cruiser. But it is still pretty significant, making it more of a poor man's capital ship, as it's relatively simple in construction. The main complex part is all the energy required to run it, and of course the massive amounts of materials needed to produce it. So the complexity is pretty low in comparison to the more high-speed battlecruisers, or of course the absolute maximum expensiveness of the battleship. In all and everything, they are fat, they are slow, but they are tough, and they are powerful. We're talking entirely firepower, armor, and resilience here. They are the heart of every low-intensity conflict as a battle group or battle fleet. They act as these massive center-line capital ships that do very little else other than go broadside to the enemy and empty as much hate into them as they possibly can. And as a result, they are the king of the battle line. They don't have to mess around with all these options and versatility. No, they just go straight at the enemy, and when they get into range with their weapons, they turn the enemy into so much space debris. And it is one of the best things about Grand Cruisers that they are so simple and so incredibly strong at their one little job. So let's get into the stats, because these are quick videos or video segments. The Grand Cruiser stats, the first one up is the one down here, the Vengeance. Now the Vengeance is the one that we're going to be going into in detail for the stats. It is a weapon tier 3. Again, tiers are by 1, 2, and 3. 3 is the highest. It means that each version of the weapon in that tier has the maximum amount of firepower, meaning that you cannot get bigger macro cannons, bigger lances than those available on Grand Cruisers, Battle Cruisers, and Battleships. There are some entire Xenos navies that will never even get access to Tier 3 weaponry because they simply don't have vessels that can mount it. Or they may have one singular vessel that has access to Tier 3 weaponry. But in speed of grav, we are slow. We are slower even than escorts with only a speed of 2 grav. Big, fat, and slow. A resilience, however, of 180. That is 60 more resilience, so that is almost 50% more durable than the average cruiser. It is massive. These things dwarf cruisers, and they massively dwarf light cruisers, and they are far more durable. What is even more, they have 4 more armor on both the front and on the sides in comparison to cruisers. An important thing to note about Grand Cruisers is that most of them don't have an armored prow, While this swept-nose prow is nice and majestic and beautiful, and some of them may even use it for things, it is the same exact armor profile as their side armor, meaning that while it doesn't have any particularly armored places, it also has exactly 0 weak spots. So the Grand Cruiser is armored universally up to a level that is better than even the prow of most cruisers. So it is incredibly heavily armored, very difficult for Tier 1 weapons to even damage the Grand Cruiser. Mostly because they don't have enough armor penetration to get through that 18 armor. They have 18 void layers as well, a significant amount of protection, even from cruiser-class vessels. And escorts, forget about penetrating that many shields on your own. Flex mountings, none. A very common thing for Grand Cruisers is 0 flexible weapons. Who are you trying to put versatility in my one-dimensional gunship? What are you doing? What kind of fool do you think I am? Slap more guns on that baby. I don't need any of these dumb, silly, flexible weapons. What year do you think this is? The 40,000th one? Nope. So, 0 flex mountings, but the vengeance is 2 Luna-class cruisers in a trench coat. That's my favorite one for this. It's 2 Luna-class cruisers in a trench coat because it has 2 Lance batteries and 2 macro cannon batteries. And remember, these are Tier 3s. They're better than Luna-class cruisers' firepower, and it has double of them. So it's almost quadruple the firepower of a Luna-class cruiser on one broadside. And it's 2 Lances on top and 2 macro cannon sets on the bottom. And it has 14 manpower, again, 14,000 crewmen minimum, and an Auspex accuracy of 20, putting it pretty even with the average cruiser. And again, the Vengeance can do almost any job. It has long-range weapons that can smash into enemies. It has short-range weapons that can remove void shields. That does also mean that the Vengeance is very, very good at dueling other Grand Cruisers. Why? Well, its macro cannons won't do a ton of damage due to the armor of enemy vessels. What it will do is strip the enemy's shields with the macro cannons, and then blast them with 2 sets of Tier 3 Lance weapons. And those will penetrate even battleship armor, doing significant damage. So this one is deadly as hell because it has both options. Not to mention that as this will be the center of any, the center of any battle fleet that goes out to, say, support a crusade, it will be directly engaging with the enemy with all of its weapon systems on both sides all at once. Meaning that the sheer firepower coming out of the Vengeance and all other Grand Cruisers is practically blistering in space. Again, one broadside from this could literally remove an escort-class vessel from existence, and it has a pretty solid chance of crippling a cruiser on the first salvo if it's at close range. The Avenger is the next one up here in the corner, and you will notice even less fancy things here. I am obsessed with 18th century naval ships. That is exactly what this tells me. It is entirely cannons. It is the exact same stats for the most part as the Vengeance, but the Avenger just has 4 macro cannon batteries per side. So it's just 1 macro cannon battery, 2 macro cannon batteries, 3 macro cannon batteries, 4 macro cannon batteries per side at Tier 3. This is the Portuguese man of war. Like the man of war Age of Sail battleship. It is pure gunpowder and firepower. It has no subtlety. It has no range consideration. It has no care for armor. All that the Avenger is and does is drive in a straight line towards whatever has offended the God Emperor, takes a 90-degree turn, and proceeds to dump 18-ton shells and a hail towards whatever enemy vessel is so unlucky as to get within this thing's sight radius. It's a mean motherfucker, and against battlecruisers especially, it's overkill. It's brutal against battlecruisers, and again, it can cripple cruisers if it hits them from the side on, which it often will do because it engages in a very aggressive charge before opening up with all 8 of its macro cannon batteries in every direction. These aren't that fast, but you know, you don't have to be fast when you have this much firepower. So, the other two Grand Cruisers that are very important, sorry that these ones are a little bit blurry, but you can find them yourself if you'd like. The Exorcist, and there are other names for the Exorcist, but the Exorcist is the main kind of abnormal one here. It is a Nimitz-class supercarrier. That's all I could really describe it as. It's a little bit less tough than the others, just because it doesn't have the armor around its weaponry, but it just has 4 launch bays per side. Again, Nimitz-class supercarrier. It can carry, literally, more than 100, no, well over 100 separate aircraft, and it can launch, I think from the statistics, if you're launching fighters, it can launch 40 fighters, 8 whole wings at the same exact time at different targets. This thing can provide air superiority for an entire planet by itself. It can ensure that every single other ship in the entire squadron, almost no matter how big it is, has close air support. And not to mention that this thing will literally be in a cloud of its own fighters to protect itself flying close air support. However, it doesn't have any firepower other than the sheer number of aircraft and bombers that it can launch. So other than that, it is the quote-unquote weakest Grand Cruiser. You know, the weakest Grand Cruiser, the strongest battle cruiser. Hilarious. But the weakest Grand Cruiser can still basically deliver horrible amounts of firepower via aircraft destruction. The last one for the Grand Cruiser stats is the Furious class Grand Cruiser. Now, this one's a little bit of an old one, and my tagline for this is, "Help, I'm an old half-battle cruiser and my engines don't work. Please let me die." This thing was literally an experiment. It was an attempt to see how much firepower and speed you could shove into a Grand Cruiser chassis. They pretty much failed with the speed thing. It still goes 2 grav, it's a little bit less tough than the others, but it has an armored prow. It has 20 armor on the front, making it the most armored Grand Cruiser, just barely. And it has the 18 on the rear. Void layers are exactly the same as all the others, but its side batteries are basically the same as the Avenger. It just has pure macro cannons, and in addition to that, much like a lot of battle cruisers, it has a fixed lance at the front, or 4 torpedo tubes total. So it's got a little bit more versatility than the Avenger, but it was an experiment that has kind of failed. And it has a lot of issues, including the fact that its engines tend to really crap out a lot of the time, trying to push this much firepower around. They simply can't handle it, and it tends to break down pretty regularly. So a lot of the Furious classes have ended up in Chaos hands. Other ones are just kept in reserve or used on very limited missions where they can get consistent support. But you know, for all that firepower, of course it has some downsides. It's got extra armor, it's got all the firepower of a regular Grand Cruiser, plus it has the frontal half of a battle cruiser with a fixed lance weapon and 4 torpedo tubes. And it has extra manpower as well. So, let us continue on to the Battlecruisers. What are Battlecruisers and what do they do? Well, Battlecruisers are the new kid on the block. They are some of the most fresh-faced capital ships in comparison to battleships and, of course, the venerable and ancient Grand Cruiser. They are high-strung and high-speed. They want to keep up with the cruisers, and that's kind of their goal. Their goal is to tote around battleship firepower while also using a cruiser chassis. And quite often you'll see that it is literally using a cruiser chassis. So it will take a cruiser-class vessel and upgun it dramatically with those Tier 3 weapons and extra firepower in order to try and make it much closer to a capital ship, and in many cases it succeeds with some significant armor improvements and especially with the armament. It does, however, sacrifice durability for firepower in comparison to things like a battleship or a Grand Cruiser. They will be less durable, they will have less armor in certain areas, and even though they will have equal firepower to something like a Grand Cruiser or a battleship, they're just not going to be as tough in the battle line. Originally, and to this day, they are an attempt to approximate the abilities of a battleship. So the battle cruiser is not made to stand up to the Grand Cruiser, or rather it's not made to emulate the Grand Cruiser. The battle cruiser is trying to copy the battleship. meaning that it's not going to have the same exact job that the Grand Cruiser is. It's not that, straight line mass fighter that's going to be dealing with things, on the individual side and any of that mess. Not going to happen. It's going to be trying to do what battleships do, which is serve a lot of different roles and absolutely excel in all of them. It falls short in many cases, but it tries to go for several different things. These are relatively expensive when compared to a Grand Cruiser, but they're not as expensive as true battleships, which is why a lot of fleets use them. Of course, it takes literal centuries to make capital ships in the Imperium, but a lot of them are basically under construction at all times, and they're churning them out at a relatively even rate. I would say there might be a new capital ship made in the Imperium every less than 50 years, I would say, roughly, because they get lost relatively often, and of course they get offlined and rebuilt quite often as well, in terms of the galaxy as a whole. So they effectively act as pocket battleships. If I am a sector governor, or if I'm a navy commander, I am going to want a battle cruiser now rather than a battleship in 10 years. The battle cruiser will do just fine, and it's going to cost me a little bit less in general, but it's not going to be as cheap as a Grand Cruiser. They are quick, aggressive, and a lot of them tend towards being more glass cannony because, of course, they are built on a cruiser chassis. You can up-armor it and up-arm it all you want. As long as you are on the limitation of being cruiser-sized, you're going to have some serious issues with your durability. And that comes out in many of the designs having less health and less armor, being more like glass cannons. And, of course, the classic taglines to these are, I need a battleship, but I don't want to pay for one. What can I do? Answer, battlecruiser. Or, help, I need a battleship now, not next century. Quick answer, battlecruiser. So, let's get into the stats, and a great example of that concept is the Armageddon-class battlecruiser. This was built off of a Luna-class chassis and given a whole bunch of upgrades, and it is referred to by me as, I am the cheapest thing ever, ever, ever. It was essentially cobbled together during the Wars for Armageddon by a shipyard that was trying to create a new type of battlecruiser to serve against massive orc battleships and orc cruisers. So they created the Armageddon. It is a Tier 3 weapon-toting vehicle. It has a speed of 3 grav, so again, while having this incredible Tier 3 firepower, it is moving at the speed of a cruiser rather than a Grand Cruiser. Its resilience, however, is only 135, putting its toughness only about 15, or its resilience about 15 above that of the cruiser, and roughly 25 below that of the Grand Cruiser, or more, even 40 plus, 45 maybe. Its armor, however, is pretty significant. You can see that as opposed to the regular cruiser, which would have an armored prow of 16 and a 3/4 armor of 14, it has +2 on both. So its frontal armor, this kind of armored prow, is 18, equal to the Grand Cruiser's all-around armor, but its side armor is still relatively low at 16. That means that a lot of weapons that would not harm the Grand Cruiser will harm the Battlecruiser from the side. Maybe not significantly, but considering its lower health, that is something to consider. It has 18 void layers, very similar to the Grand Cruisers. However, it has 2 flex mountings, 2 flexible guns on the top of the ship. That is a pretty significant advantage in terms of versatility, but it doesn't stop there. The Armageddon, of course, being made off of the Corpse, or the design model of the Luna class, has a Tier 3 macro cannon battery and a Tier 1 lance battery. That means, of course, that it can target things at long range with a high armor piercing weapon, and it can knock out shields and deal damage at shorter range with a macro cannon battery. Having the flex weapons gives it extra versatility, and theoretically it can enhance either of those by adding more macro weapons as flex mountings or more lances. And of course, as with many battlecruisers and many cruisers, instead of the Grand Cruiser's slick nose, it has 6 torpedo tubes. Meaning, again, we are talking about a vehicle that has better weapons than the Luna class, and yet has almost the same exact layout. Macro cannons, lances, flexes, which the Luna doesn't have, and torpedo tubes. But the manpower is pretty similar to a cruiser at 10, and the Auspex accuracy is exactly the same. The reason that this is so cheap is that other than the weapons and the improvement to armor and the orbital flex weapons, which could be gotten from any number of places, this is literally just a Grand Cruiser, or literally just a Luna-class cruiser. They're very simple. Lunas are everywhere. Chop-shopping a Luna and putting the Armageddon structure into it is perfectly reasonable. Now, it does come with downsides. There are cobbled-together aspects that are an issue for this thing. However, the cobbled-together aspect really becomes worse when we get into the Chalice-class battlecruiser. Now, I am not a Chalice hater. I understand the reason why the Chalice class exists. However, it has some problems that you'll notice right off the bat. The first one is the lack of an armored prow. It is sporting almost the same exact armor as a cruiser, just a little bit improved, and it is less armored than either a battleship, or another battlecruiser, or the Grand Cruiser. So it's got a little bit of lack in armor, kind of that glass cannon coming through. And then, much like the Armageddon, 2 flex mounts, pretty regular. However, it trades out the lance weapon for another set of macro cannons. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at 2 sets of macro cannons and 2 flex weapons, and of course, the requisite 6 torpedo tubes for a battlecruiser. Now that's pretty punchy. That's pretty high damage, but here's the issue. This is a battlecruiser. This is expected to go directly into enemy fire, and it can still be damaged by Tier 1 laser weapons. And I've put the tagline quite prophetically as, "For the love of God, please let me die. I don't want to be an experimental glass cannon anymore, because the Chalice has a reputation for exploding under consistent enemy fire. It has lighter armor than most capital ships, which means that if you use it against other capital ships, it doesn't have the option to stay far away because all of its weapons, other than the torpedo tubes, are usually going to be short range. So it kind of has to charge at more heavily armed, more heavily armored enemies, and hope to the love of the god Emperor that it doesn't get blasted out of the sky before it manages to turn 2 and unleash its double set of macro weapons. So the Chalice, as much as I love it, is a bit of an odd duck, and it does suffer from some of the classic battlecruiser being a glass cannon stereotypes. The next ones up are the Overlord, which is down here, and the Mars or the Dominion class. So the Overlord is a pretty classic battlecruiser. It's a little bit less tough than the others, a little bit more tough than the others with 150 resilience. These ones are much larger, significantly better in that way, but you can also notice that it has way more armor at the front. This one is definitely designed as a charging vessel with 20 frontal armor, again reaching up to that more battleship level rather than just the standard battlecruiser armor. Its void layers are a standard 18. It has 2 flex mountings up front, 2 macro cannon batteries, and 6 torpedo tubes. So again, I am trying very hard to just be a Grand Cruiser. So it's compensating with extra health, compensating with extra frontal armor, but it's essentially armed the exact same way as the Chalice. Other than the extra armor and the torpedo tubes, this is pretty close to trying to copy the Avenger. It's trying really hard to copy the Avenger. So it's, again, just going to be a pure macro cannon build. You charge, you fire your flex weapons, you fire your torpedoes, you use your massive, thick 20 frontal armor to absorb anything but the most damaging of Tier 2 or the average Tier 3 shots, and then you turn sideways and unleash hell with 2 sets of Tier 3 macro cannon batteries. A lot of firepower in these things, but nothing really all that unusual in terms of capital vessels. Let's talk about things that are unusual in terms of capital vessels. The Mars or the Dominion class, also known as You Want It? We Got It. The Mars or Dominion is one of the more impressive ones. It uses the same architecture as the Overlord in terms of having heavy frontal armor, but it actually has some nasty teeth to go with its compensating extra protection and health. And those nasty teeth come in the form of a full-on Nova Cannon. Now again, Nova Cannon is probably the highest damage, longest range, most deadly weapon in the Imperium of Man, and hell, probably in the galaxy, short of weapons like the planet-destroying weapons of the Chaos Forces. Other than that one unique ship, full-on Nova cannons are probably some of the heaviest ordnance that Imperial vessels can use, or regular Imperial vessels. And yeah, the Mars is still a regular vessel, it's just a regular capital ship. However, it also has other options. Of course, it has its requisite 2 flex weapons to go along with the Nova cannon if those were long range. For example, a standard build for the Mars might be 2 lance weapons, the Nova cannon, that's all your long range, that's all you really need, because that will destroy most escorts outright. And then, of course, it has a set of macro cannons to deal with anything that comes close, and it has a launch bay. Now, this is incredibly strange. Why a launch bay in addition to all this firepower? Why not double up on firepower and try and match a battleship? Well, that's just the, or sorry, try and match a Grand Cruiser. Well, that's just the thing. We're not trying to match the Grand Cruisers, we're trying to match the battleships. And battleships like the Oberon are going for those more every single option is on the table, which is what the Mars and Dominion is trying to do. It will outfire any other cruiser on the field, especially with the Nova cannon. But even without it, with the flex weapons and the macro weapons, it will manage to outgun most cruisers. And, in addition to being able to knock out enemy cruisers, it has a very high damage weapon in order to destroy enemy capital ships, and it has aircraft not only to defend itself, but to deal direct damage to enemy capital ships. So the Mars or Dominion class has a lot of unique options when it comes to its firepower, when it comes to its deployment, and of course, unlike a lot of other Grand Cruisers, which are kind of pigeonholed into one or another type of fighting style, the Mars and the Dominion class both have a lot more versatility, a lot closer to the battleship they're trying to emulate, rather than trying to go for one or another special thing. And then the last 2 for the Battlecruisers are a little bit fuzzy as usual, but the first one is another weird oddity, the Mercury or the Long Serpent class. Now this is a battlecruiser, but you'll notice it has something odd. It is faster and lighter. It is much closer to a heavier cruiser, but it is definitely a battlecruiser based on its firepower. It has a speed of 4 grav, which puts it moving faster than any other battlecruiser on this list. It has a resilience of 130, which only puts it a little bit lower than the earlier battlecruisers that we looked at, and it has less armor, much more on par with a cruiser in terms of its armor protection. 16 in the front in its armored prow, and 14 on the sides, putting it very low for a capital ship. 16 void layers, again, low for a capital ship. 2 flex mountings, pretty standard as we've seen so far, and 2 macro cannon batteries. Up to this point, the only weird thing about this is the speed. Oh, it has a Nova cannon too. The advantage of the Mercury Long Serpent is it's fast as hell, it's armed like a battlecruiser, and it totes a Nova cannon. That's the big thing, and it's got crazy good aspects too, so you can't hide from it. And the biggest thing with this is even Chaos Pirates fear me. Chaos Pirates fear me. Pirates in general fear the Mercury Long Serpent, because the Mercury class can chase you down, and it has one of the most deadly weapons in the Imperium of Man in the form of a full-on Nova cannon. So, just to be clear, this thing is literally just a cruiser. In terms of chassis, in terms of almost everything except for its extra health, it is just a cruiser. And it has better weapons. But it's armed like a battlecruiser, so it can chase down those rangy enemy light cruisers or those rangy enemy cruisers that are going fast, and it can hit them with the Nova cannon and blast them apart with double macro cannon batteries. This is a nasty ship for anti-piracy duties, and it is really, really hard to get rid of considering how high its health is. And then the last one here, one of the odd takes, just another one like the Defender that's just a little bit odd, the Jovian class. There's not a ton of these. One of them is the Banner of Slato from the Sabbat Worlds Crusade. It is a pure carrier. All that it has is 2 launch bays and 2 flex mountings. It has frontal armor of a battlecruiser, the health of a battlecruiser with 145 resilience, 3 speed, but other than that, the 2 launch bays and 2 flex mountings, that's about it. What is this for? Well, behold the power of a Grand Cruiser carrier in a battlecruiser chassis. It is essentially maxing out the amount of aircraft that it could deploy, similar to the Exorcist. This is one of the only battlecruisers that isn't trying to copy a battleship, it's trying to copy a Grand Cruiser. So it's taking the Exorcist as a model, or the Emperor-class Grand Cruiser, depending on the Nemesis class, the Exorcist or the Nemesis class, and it is trying to upgun it with 2 flex weapons, and then on top of that, it has all these aircraft abilities, so it can shoot out all types of aircraft, it can bomb enemy ships, it can bomb other areas, it can provide close air support for an entire fleet, so it gives that significant kind of versatile X factor of a battleship, but it is in a battlecruiser chassis. So, our last one, and the one that we've been building up to, I was intending to make this one a little bit longer because I knew that the last one was rather short. I apologize for that. Battleships. What are they, and what do they do? They are ships that battle. Shush, I know that. I will ask you a riddle. I am old, but I am not so old that I am useless. I am not a grand cruiser. I do not suffer these mortal limitations. Shut up, I'm about to expand out of my mortal shell. The glory of the battleship is that while its design is aged, it is no worse for having age. It aged like fine wine, and it is pretty much one of the best ships in 40k. It has a balance between the firepower of the Grand Cruiser and the mobility and armor options and the versatility of Battlecruisers. It has a best of both worlds going on. It is a cruiser killer. Unlike even the Grand Cruisers, which have some limitations against certain types of cruisers or even certain types of enemy cruisers, the battleship does not suffer these limitations. The battleship kills cruisers like the cruiser kills escorts. It is an annihilating force against enemy cruisers. In a one-on-one conflict, it is not a challenge. The cruiser is simply outclassed. Against other capital ships, the battleship has a significant advantage in both its versatility and its armor protection and durability. These are massive ships with enormous crews and very thick armor. On the downside, they are the most expensive ships in all of 40k. Bar none, battleships are more expensive than anything else. They are so expensive that most sectors will not have more than one battleship. True battleship. I'm not talking capital ships, genuine battleship. They will probably only have one, and that one battleship will only be called out if there is literally enemy capital ships that they are definitely going against Imperial World. So they are like the Titans of the Navy world. They are only called out when enemy capital ships are guaranteed to be part of a fight. And then the battleship will come out of its, 50 years of retirement and just kind of show up like Rocky Balboa after 17 rounds fighting against the same dude. He just comes out all fresh and blows the dude's head off. That's literally how battleships are. They just come out of long retirement, storage, and maintenance cycles. They show up to the battlefield, they kill everything that is possible to be seen, and then they go back. These are not really on patrols. They are not really in constant contact with any enemy, because no enemy can really resist them for long. They are a massive force projection. They are capable of stopping entire enemy fleets and flotillas cold, almost by themselves. If you're an enemy Chaos Warband, and you think you're oh so hot shit, you show up with your cruiser and your 4 escorts, and you're like, yeah, I'm about to invade a planet, and there's an apocalypse battleship sitting above that planet. You better change your plans real fast, quick, and in a hurry, because there's no chance that your little cruiser and your little flotilla of escorts are gonna do anything to that battleship. You don't have a snowball's chance in hell. So, really, the only people who can stand up to battleships are other capital ships. And even those, the battleship has an advantage against in its versatility. And the reasons to get the battleship? I need something to crown my sector's navy. I'm gonna order it, not even me, the sector governor before me might have ordered a battleship. But when it gets to me, when I've, reached 150 years old and it's been in construction for 300 years, and it finally gets off the presses and finally gets to be part of my thing, that is straight up a reason for an entire sector to celebrate. Literally, to observe a day of celebration, because one of the most potent weapons in the Imperium's arsenal now defends us. And that is I can imagine literally everyone feeling a visceral sense of relief when a battleship shows up. Because essentially, never do these things get knocked out easily. It never happens. There are examples of it in lore and in books, but it is terribly badly written considering how big and durable these things are. Again, I'll go into that if I ever talk about how the actual battling works in these and examples of bad writing and examples of good writing, but battleships, they are a crown to a sector's navy. And the second reason is I need a ship that can do everything well and do capital ship things extraordinarily well. Orbital bombardment, yep. Exterminatus, got it. Planetary invasion, got it. Planetary bombardment, got it. Embargoes on trade, got it. Dealing with pirates, got it. Dealing with Black Crusades, got it. Dealing with any of these. It essentially, if there's a task that ships can do in the Imperium, the battleship can do it, and do it better than ships usually designed for that job. It does kind of depend upon the type of battleship, but even if you're having a battleship do a job it's not supposed to do, it will do it as well as a ship that is supposed to. So let's talk about the types of battleships. The first one is the Apocalypse class, or the Victory class. I prefer the Apocalypse. The Apocalypse is one of my favorite ships in all of 40k, mostly because of my beloved Incarnadine, the Archons flagship. My flagship is an Apocalypse-class battleship. It is a Chaos capital ship, one of the few that we have in canon, and one of my absolute favorites. It is a full-on Apocalypse. It is a Tier 3 weapon, of course. It is only going to grav. Battleships are very slow. However, they don't really need to be fast, because they have 200 resilience. The Apocalypse has 200 resilience. As a reference, the average light cruiser has about 100. So the battleship is twice as durable as a light cruiser, with the advantage of, just having 23 frontal armor, being the most heavily armored ship in the entire setting. 23 armor will essentially mean that from the front, you are practically invulnerable to almost every Tier 2 weapon in existence. Cruisers simply cannot harm you effectively from the front. Now, from the side, you're only as armored as a Grand Cruiser. Only as armored as a full-on capital ship right from the rear. So, you might want to worry about other capital ships trying to flank you. However, in terms of cruisers, that's still going to stymie a lot of different weapons, and you are practically immune to Tier 1 weapons. Escorts cannot really harm you with their own weaponry. They have to rely on things like torpedoes, aircraft, and front-facing lance weapons in order to even scratch the paint off of a battleship. The Apocalypse has 4 flex mountings. 1, 2, 3, 4 flex mountings. That can be, again, missiles, plasma, macro cannons, or lances. Quadrupling up on lances with the Apocalypse is just hilarious, because the Apocalypse's main armament is just 3 frickin' banks of lances. So, to be clear, this vessel, its main armament is just long-range, high armor-piercing, Tier 3 lance weapons. And it has 3 of them on each side. Just take that in for a second. This can atomize. This can bring a full-on light cruiser from half shields and full health down to nothing with a single broadside and a couple of flex shots. Heck, if you give it all of its flex weapons, you can actually destroy a light cruiser in its entirety with a single full-on broadside. You can obliterate cruiser-sized ships in one single broadside, if you focus all your weapons upon it. That's not even the last weapon, though. The last weapon is another Nova Cannon. Another full-on Nova Cannon. just like the Mars class. Not a light Nova Cannon, nope, full-on Nova Cannon. So to be clear, with 14 manpower and 24 accuracy, the quote line goes as, "I hit everything very hard, all the time. There is no escaping the many lasers of the apocalypse." This thing is so well armed and so well armored that it can shred the armor off of other capital ships. It can puncture Grand Cruisers. It can dumpster Battlecruisers. It can absolutely trash most cruisers before they even get close to piercing its 20 layers of void shields. Not to mention that with 24 Auspex accuracy, it's shooting a lot of aircraft and torpedoes out of the sky before they even get close. And you can, of course, sacrifice one of your flex weapons to just put a flat cannon in there and make it even more likely that you intercept enemy aircraft and torpedoes before they even get to you. I love the Apocalypse class so frickin' much. So, let's move on to something equally ridiculous, but slightly more funny. The Emperor or Nemesis class. So, there is a similar named one, the Exorcist for the Grand Cruisers, but this is the Emperor Nemesis class battleship. Again, Tier 3, 2 grav, a little bit less resilience at 190 because it's got launch bays. Same armor as the Apocalypse, but unlike the Apocalypse, it even has more void shields because it doesn't require as much power for the Nova Cannon and for all the lances. So 22 layers of voids, one of the heaviest void-shielded ships in the Imperium. Again, shielded on a level that you would normally see for an entire hive city, not a ship. 5 flex mountings, so even more flex weaponry than the Apocalypse has, because, you know, why not? Just put more turrets on this thing, it's huge anyway. And then, of course, its side batteries, or either it has a choice, can choose between either, or, well, not choice, but it can be constructed with either a macro cannon battery of, again, Tier 3 and 2 launch bays, or just go full manic and just pick 3 launch bays. Again, battleship, 3 launch bays. Remember back to our Grand Cruisers, where they had 4 launch bays on either side? Same exact thing here. Same exact effect. Same chilling nightmare effect of having hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of aircraft just constantly cycling in and out of the battle, constantly bombarding you, constantly destroying your torpedoes and aircraft, constantly harassing the shit out of you. And then on top of that, it can mount a ton of flex weaponry, possibly a macro cannon, and, you know, just for the hell of it, it also gets a fixed forward lance weapon. So, let me be clear. Let's go stem to stern on this son of a bitch. Lance weapon at the front, high-powered Tier 3 forward lance. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 flex weapons, which could be lances, missiles, plasma, flat cannons, macro cannons, whatever they want. Then macro cannons or 3 whole launch bays or 2 whole launch bays. So, as per my quote, I have enough aircraft to destroy enemy cruisers or multiple escorts before they even get close to me. But even if they did get close to me, not only do I have macro cannons of my own, I have 5 flex weapons, and I have 22 void shields, and the same armor profile as the Apocalypse. You understand what I'm saying now when I say that these things are practically unbeatable, and they dumpster cruisers. They crush them with no real resistance because they just have so much overwhelming firepower and protection. So, moving on to the Oberyn. It is one of the odd battleships, and you'll notice a consistent theme here. These type of ships with this type of layout, I tend to have a dim view of them. However, the Oberyn is a battleship and is thus awesome by inherence. It has a little bit less resilience at 195. However, same armor profile as all the other battleships so far, and same 22 void layers as the other ones. 5 flex mountings, as before. Again, variety choice here. And then on its side batteries, it has a smorgasbord, a vast variety, a charcuterie board of options. It has a launch bay at the rear. It has a lance battery in the center, and then it has a macro battery at the front. Oh joy! So it has every single type of broadside weapon available to a ship in the Imperium on every single one of these Oberyn-class battleships. Oh boy. So again, when we talk about the Luna, when we talk about all of these different types of, it can do different jobs, it can make different things, this is maximum versatility times maximum size. And then, of course, just slap 5 flex weapons on the top. 5 orbital flex weapons. That could be 5 lasers, and all of a sudden you have something that could shoot at massive distances and do tons of damage. Could be plasma, high armor piercing. Could be missiles, hitting lots of different targets, or hitting the same target many times. And then, of course, macro cannons if you want to knock out shields faster. Flak cannons if you just want to say no to every single aircraft carrier in the local distance. It is brutally effective how many targets this thing can affect, and of course it carries its own air cover, it carries its own long range weapons, and it carries its own short range weapons, because why the hell not? So read my lips. Jack of all trades, master of none, in this case only, is still always better than a master of one. Again, usually I don't go by that phrase because Jack of all trades is usually a bad thing, but the Oberon is big enough that it can just barely pull it off. Just barely. I still got my eyes on this thing. I still don't trust it entirely because it's got deficiencies. Other things could have more firepower than it. However, goddamn, it's pretty big, and it's tough to out-firepower this thing without having a legit capital ship. And of course, the versatility more than makes up for it in the fact that it can achieve many different battlefield roles. And then the last one for the battleships, I think it's the last one, yes it is the Retribution class. You remember how the Grand Cruisers had an obsession with cannons and you just have a bunch of This is that. This is pretty much that. It is the same thing, 200 resilience, we're going back up to the tough boys. 24 armor, the most armor on any ship in the Imperium. 18 on the sides, again, standard for a battleship. 22 void layers, again, that incredible amount of void protection. All of its flex mountings are noted as being lance weapons. Now, why would that be? Why are its flex weapons lances? Wouldn't you want to have the option? No, the Retribution is not about options. The Retribution is about retribution. It has 3 sets of macro cannon batteries per side, plus 6 torpedo tubes. So all that the Retribution is a more heavily armored, more heavily shielded, tougher version of an 18th century man-of-war. All it does is go straight towards the enemy, ignoring all enemy fire, cruising through any enemy escorts, obliterating anything in its path, and then when it gets close to an enemy, it turns sideways, and it just blows them into literal pieces. And you might ask, well, what's the point of the lances? Well, of course, when I strike an enemy capital ship with my 3 sets of macro cannon batteries, my lances can go in and do pinpoint targeting to destroy them with their high armor piercing and damage. They're literally meant to finish off whatever the macro cannons don't kill. That's exactly what this is made for. It's such an elegantly simple design. You drive in a straight-ass direction, you go towards the sound of gunfire, you fire your torpedoes, for just whatever the hell, and then once you get into range, open up with all guns, and then turn the lances on anything that survives the first broadside. And the quote, of course, for this is, "I have so many fucking cannons." While it may have technically less firepower than the Grand Cruiser, it is nowhere close in terms of having more flex weapons and more flexibility, not to mention significantly more health and armor that allows it to use much more of that firepower for significantly longer, and of course at much closer ranges than the Battlecruiser, or than the Grand Cruiser could manage. Alrighty, so that has been the end of our Imperial side of the Navy stuff, of the Navy videos. What's coming up next is going to be another similar long video like this, specifically for Chaos. It's going to be all of the escorts, cruisers, and light cruisers in one video, and then all of the heavy cruisers and capital ships in another video. I will not be doubling up, and Space Marine vessels will probably take another time, but some of them will be included in the Chaos side of things. I will note which ones are both ways, but either way, I did say that I was going to do double, and here's your double. We finished the Imperial side of things, so stick with me, join your friends. I'm super excited. When we get to 500 subscribers, we have a special subscriber special with all of my art that's coming in, all of the changes to the channel that are going to happen, joining our Discord, increasing our viewership and reach. But outside of that, send around to people, get our names out, subscribe if you can, and I wish you all a lovely good night.